The morning of my grandmother's estate reading was one of those gray October days that make you feel like the sky itself is holding its breath. I drove alone to the offices of Harrington and Cole on Bay Street in Toronto, my hands tight on the wheel, already rehearsing how to keep my face neutral no matter what happened inside. I knew what was coming. I'd known for weeks, ever since my uncle pulled me aside at the funeral reception and smiled in that particular way of his, warm on the surface, cold underneath, like ice wrapped in velvet. "Your grandmother loved you, Claire," he'd said, squeezing my shoulder just a little too hard. But she was practical. She understood who kept this family running. By who kept this family running, he meant himself. He always did. I was 29 years old, working as a music teacher at a high school in Mississauga, and in the eyes of my family, that made me exactly the kind of person who collected sentimental trinkets while the adults handled real business. My grandmother, Evelyn Ashford, had built Ashford Textiles from a single fabric shop on Queen Street into a mid-sized clothing manufacturer, with contracts across Canada. My uncle, Daniel Ashford, had spent the last 15 years positioning himself as her right hand, her trusted successor, the son who stayed close while I, her only grandchild who'd actually sat with her every Sunday for the last decade, was the girl who'd wasted her education on music. The boardroom at Harrington and Cole had dark wood paneling and chairs that felt like they were designed to make you sit up very straight. Daniel was already there when I arrived, his wife Patricia beside him, both of them dressed like they were attending a shareholder meeting rather than a family reading. My Aunt Rosemary, my grandmother's younger sister, sat quietly near the window. She gave me a small, tired smile. The lawyer, a compact woman named Miss Tran, adjusted her reading glasses and began without ceremony. "To my nephew Daniel Ashford, the estate of Evelyn Ashford bequeaths the controlling interest in Ashford Textiles, the family residence in Rosedale, and the investment portfolio held in trust." Daniel didn't move, but I saw the satisfaction settle into him like warmth spreading through a room. "To my granddaughter Claire Ashford, the estate bequeaths the personal contents of the music room at the Rosedale residence, including the upright piano, the sheet music collection, and all associated items therein." The room was very quiet. Daniel coughed once, not from discomfort, but to cover a laugh he was choosing not to show me directly. Patricia reached over and touched his arm, the gesture of someone congratulating a winner who needs to look gracious. "The music room?" I said, hearing my own voice come out steadier than I expected. "That's all?" Miss Tran looked at me with careful, professional kindness. "Those are the terms as written, yes." I thought about my grandmother, about the way she'd sit beside me on Sunday afternoons while I played, her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap. About the last visit, 3 weeks before she died, when she'd held both my hands and looked at me for a long time without saying anything, and then finally said, "You've always listened, Claire. Most people hear, you actually listen. That's rarer than you think." I'd thought she was being sentimental, the way people get near the end. I stood up, thanked Miss Tran, and left without looking at my uncle. The drive to the Rosedale house was automatic, muscle memory guiding me through streets I'd traveled since childhood. The housekeeper, an older Jamaican-Canadian woman named Vera who'd worked for my grandmother for over 20 years, opened the door before I could knock. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "Miss Claire," she said, and pulled me into a hug that lasted long enough to make my throat tighten. "Come in, sweetheart. Come in." The house already felt different, quieter in the wrong way. Some of the small decorative items in the front hallway had been moved, shifted slightly, like someone had been looking through them. "Your uncle was here yesterday," Vera said quietly, following my gaze. "Him and 2 men I've never seen before. Said he was doing an inventory." "The day after the reading?" She pressed her lips together. "The day before." I walked through to the music room at the back of the house. It was the one room in the Rosedale house that had always felt entirely my grandmother's, not the formal sitting rooms or the dining room that had been used for entertaining business contacts, but this small space with its high window and its shelves of worn sheet music and the old upright Heintzman piano my grandmother had bought secondhand in 1974 and never replaced because, as she always said, It had the right kind of voice. Vera helped me carry things to my car in 2 trips. Most of it was straightforward stacks of sheet music, a wooden metronome, a few framed photographs of my grandmother as a young woman. The piano would need to be moved by professionals later. On my second trip back into the room, I noticed that one of the framed photographs on the top shelf had been turned slightly. Not fallen, turned. Deliberately. My grandmother was meticulous. She would never have left anything at an angle. I took it down. It was a photo I'd seen 100 times. My grandmother at a piano, in what looked like a small studio, much younger, maybe 30, her hair dark and her expression caught in a private moment of concentration. I'd always assumed it was taken at some recording space or music school. I turned the frame over. The backing paper had been lifted and resealed, so carefully you'd almost miss it, but the edge of the paper was just slightly raised. The kind of detail you notice if you're the sort of person who notices things. My hands were steady as I peeled back the paper. There was a folded piece of notepaper tucked inside the backing, covered in my grandmother's handwriting, that distinctive script of hers, small and precise, slanted slightly to the left. I read the first line and sat down on the piano bench because my legs stopped working. My darling Claire, if you are reading this, you found it the way I knew you would. Not by searching, by paying attention. I sat in the music room for a long time after that, reading and rereading those 3 pages in my grandmother's handwriting while the October light shifted across the floor. Vera had left me alone, seeming to understand that whatever was in that note needed space around it. My grandmother hadn't been the warm, quiet woman in the background of Ashford Textiles that everyone assumed. She had been its architect in ways that had been systematically written out of the company's official history, not by strangers, but by her own nephew, who had spent 15 years ensuring that Evelyn Ashford was remembered as a figurehead while he positioned himself as the true engine of the company's success. The music room, she'd written, was never just a room. It was where I kept what I couldn't say out loud. The piano. Listen to the piano, Claire. You always knew how to listen. I looked at the Heintzman. I'd played it since I was 7 years old. I knew every sticky key, every slightly flat note in the upper register. I had never, in all those years, thought to look inside it. The action panel of an upright piano is the front piece that lifts away to reveal the hammers and strings. My grandmother had shown me how to remove it once, years ago, for tuning purposes. I hadn't done it since. The action panel came off in my hands, and behind the hammers, taped carefully to the back of the soundboard with the kind of care that only someone who knew exactly what she was doing would think to take, were 2 things. A USB drive in a small waterproof case, and a handwritten index card with a single line of text in my grandmother's writing. Ashford Textiles, the real story. Everything you'll need. The password is the first piece I ever taught you. My hands were shaking now. I knew the password instantly. The first piece my grandmother ever taught me was a simplified version of Für Elise. I was 6, and she'd sat beside me on this exact bench and guided my fingers note by note. I had played it at her memorial 2 weeks ago. I put the USB drive in my coat pocket, replaced the action panel, and texted Vera from the front hallway. I'm going to come back for the piano. Is that okay for the next few days? Her reply came within a minute. It's your piano, sweetheart. It's always been yours. I'd been home for less than an hour when my phone rang. It was Daniel. I heard you came by the house today, he said. No preamble. Did you take everything you needed? The things that were left to me, yes. A pause. There was a photograph. In the music room. On the top shelf. Did you happen to come across it? The photograph was sitting on my kitchen counter, 2 feet away from where I was standing. I don't remember a photograph, I said. Another pause, longer this time. Claire. His voice took on a different quality, not quite threatening, but the friendliness had been removed, the way you'd strip off an outer layer when it was no longer needed. Your grandmother was an old woman. She wasn't always clear-headed toward the end. If she left anything, documents, notes, any kind of personal papers, they'd need to be reviewed by the estate before. I really don't remember a photograph, I said. I'll let you know if I come across anything. Thanks for checking in, Daniel. I ended the call before he could respond. I plugged in the USB drive at 11 o'clock that night, with a glass of water I forgot to drink sitting beside my laptop. The drive contained over 400 files. My grandmother had been organized to a degree that made my chest ache, everything labeled, dated, cross-referenced. Financial documents going back 12 years. Internal memos. Email chains she had printed and scanned. Draft patent applications, never submitted. A folder labeled simply Daniel, and inside it, a document trail that took me 3 hours to get through, at the end of which I sat back from my laptop and stared at my kitchen ceiling for a long time. My grandmother had developed a proprietary fabric treatment process in 2011, a finishing technique that significantly reduced water usage in textile manufacturing, which had become the basis for Ashford Textiles' most profitable product line and the source of 2 industry awards the company had received in 2014 and 2016. Both awards were accepted by Daniel. His name was on the patent. His photograph was in the trade magazines. My grandmother's name appeared nowhere. The document trail in the Daniel folder told the story clearly. She had developed the process, she had documented it, she had trusted her nephew to file the patent jointly, and he had filed it alone, after quietly restructuring her role in the company to an advisory position that carried no intellectual property rights. She had discovered what he'd done within 6 months, but by then she was already 73, already beginning the health decline that would occupy the last years of her life, and Daniel had made very clear in an email she had printed and kept, presumably because she knew she might need it, that a legal challenge would be damaging to the family, to the company, and to her legacy. He had threatened her with her own legacy. There was a final document in the folder, created 8 months before she died, a legal memorandum, not from Harrington and Cole but from a different firm, a small IP-focused practice on Adelaide Street, outlining the framework for a challenge to the patent. The memo was addressed to my grandmother. At the bottom, in her handwriting, "Not yet. Wait for Claire." I read those 3 words 4 times. She had known she wasn't going to be able to finish this herself. She had known, and she had built the whole thing around me, finding it, the note in the photograph, the drive in the piano, the password she'd given me at 6 years old. She had designed this for the person she knew I'd become. Not the person my uncle dismissed, but the person she'd been watching all those years. The person who listened. I didn't sleep that night. I spent it going through every file on the drive, building a chronology in a notebook that I filled front to back by 5 in the morning. My phone buzzed at 7 a.m. My uncle again. I let it go to voicemail. He called back immediately, and I let that go too. The 3rd time, I answered. "We need to talk," he said, and his voice had changed again. The practiced warmth was completely gone now. "In person. Today." "I'm busy today," I said. "Claire." A pause. "I know your grandmother left you some things. Notes, possibly some files. I want you to understand that whatever she wrote, she wasn't well at the end, and some of what she believed wasn't." "I'm busy today, Daniel," I said. "I'll be in touch." I had 2 calls to make before anything else. The first was to my Aunt Rosemary, my grandmother's younger sister, who had been sitting quietly by the window at the estate reading, and who I had always instinctively trusted in the vague, unexamined way you trust people who never seem to want anything from you. Rosemary picked up on the second ring. "I found something," I said. "In the music room. I need to talk to someone who knew her well." A pause. Then, very quietly, "I've been waiting for you to call, Claire." We met at Rosemary's apartment in the annex that afternoon. She was 71, small and sharp-eyed, and she had a pot of tea waiting, and the composed expression of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was finally, carefully, setting it down. She'd known about the process. She'd watched what Daniel did. She'd watched her sister's health decline under the weight of it, and she had held her tongue because my grandmother had asked her to, had made her promise to wait, to not act until the time was right, until Claire was ready. "She talked about you constantly in the last year," Rosemary said, her hands wrapped around her mug. "About how you were the one who inherited her way of seeing things. How you'd know what to do when the time came. She looked at me steadily. She was right, wasn't she? I showed her the USB drive. She looked at the document summary I'd prepared in my notebook and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I know a lawyer. A good one. Not Harrington and Cole." Her name was Nadia Okafor, a senior partner at a firm specializing in intellectual property and estate disputes. We met at her office on King Street West 3 days later. I brought every document on the drive, printed and organized. Rosemary sat beside me. Nadia Okafor reviewed the file summary without expression, which I suspected was a professional habit. When she looked up, she said, "This is substantial. I want to be honest with you, this kind of case takes time, but the documentation here is unusually thorough." She paused. "Your grandmother was preparing for this for years." "She was," I said. "Then she gave you something very valuable." Nadia set down the summary. "Not just the evidence. The preparation. She already did most of the hardest work." Over the following 3 weeks, I taught my classes during the day and spent my evenings working with Nadia and her team. Daniel called twice more. I didn't answer. He sent a letter through Harrington and Cole suggesting I return any personal correspondence belonging to the estate within 14 days. Nadia reviewed the letter and told me to set it aside. Rosemary told me, 2 weeks in, that Daniel had come to see her, that he'd been friendly at first, then less so, that he'd suggested the family would lose everything if this went forward. She'd shown him to the door. What happened next moved faster than I expected. The IP law firm my grandmother had consulted 8 months before her death had, it turned out, already done substantial preliminary work on the patent challenge based on her documentation. They had been waiting for authorization to proceed, authorization that now rested with me, as the person my grandmother had designated in a notarized letter held by that firm, a letter prepared quietly, without Harrington and Cole's involvement. My grandmother had been more thorough than any of us knew. Daniel received formal notice on a Thursday morning. I know this because Rosemary called me that afternoon to say he'd appeared at her door again, not friendly this time, not even performing it, and that she'd told him to contact his lawyer because she had nothing to say to him personally. He tried to reach me through Patricia. I didn't respond. He tried through a cousin I'd barely spoken to in years, which told me he was running out of options. The patent challenge was filed 6 weeks after the estate reading. Ashford Textiles' board of directors, many of whom had apparently harbored private doubts about Daniel's management for some time, called an emergency meeting within a week of the filing. The story that emerged from that meeting, the real history of the fabric treatment process, the documentation my grandmother had kept, the paper trail of what Daniel had done was not, ultimately, something the board could defend. Daniel resigned from Ashford Textiles on a Tuesday in December. I remember it was snowing, the first proper snowfall of the season, and I was between classes when Nadia called to tell me. I stood in the hallway of the school and looked out the window at the snow for a minute before I said anything. "What happens now?" I asked. "The board has requested a meeting with you," Nadia said. "They'd like to discuss the future of the company." I went to that meeting, and I listened more than I spoke, which I think surprised them. What I asked for was not what they expected. I didn't ask to run the company. I was a music teacher, and I intended to remain one, at least for now. What I asked for was a formal reattribution of the fabric treatment patent to my grandmother's estate, a public acknowledgement of her contribution to the company she had built, and the establishment of a small innovation fund in her name to support women-owned manufacturing businesses in Ontario, and fair compensation to the estate, which Nadia had already quantified in a document that made several board members visibly uncomfortable. They agreed to all of it. On the day the patent was formally reattributed, I went back to the Rosedale house. Daniel had vacated it by then, per the terms of a separate legal settlement, and I sat in the music room for a while. The Heintzman piano was still there, which I hadn't expected. Vera was still there too, which I had hoped. She made tea, and we sat in the kitchen the way she and my grandmother used to, and Vera told me stories about my grandmother as a younger woman, stories I hadn't heard, about who she'd been before she became the composed matriarch of the family, before she'd learned to hold things quietly until the right moment. She used to say that patience isn't the same as doing nothing, Vera told me, turning her mug in her hands. She said the hardest kind of strength is the kind you carry quietly, for a long time, until the moment comes. I thought about those words for a long time afterward. I moved the Heintzman piano to my apartment in Mississauga. It sits in my living room now, and I play it most evenings after work. My students think it's funny that their music teacher has a full, upright piano in her living room. I tell them it belonged to my grandmother, and that's explanation enough. Daniel sent a message 4 months after the settlement, brief and unapologetic, suggesting we could find a way to move forward as family if I was open to it. I thought about how to respond for several days. In the end, I didn't. Some doors, once you see what was behind them, don't need to be reopened. Rosemary and I have dinner every couple of weeks now, at her apartment in the annex, with good food and no agenda. She's teaching me to make the Jamaican ginger cake that my grandmother used to bring to family dinners and never once shared the recipe for. It turns out Rosemary has had it all along. The Evelyn Ashford Innovation Fund made its first award last spring, a young woman from Hamilton with a process for sustainable dye application in small batch fabric manufacturing. She was 26 and had been turned down by 3 traditional funding bodies. When I handed her the check at the ceremony, she looked like she couldn't quite believe it was real, and I understood that feeling exactly. The photograph is on my piano now, my grandmother at 30, sitting at a piano in some unknown studio, caught in a moment of complete absorption, not performing for anyone. I look at it when I play. What my grandmother left me in that music room turned out to be worth more than the Rosedale house, more than the portfolio, more than the controlling interest in a company built on her own work, while her name was stripped from it. What she left me was the evidence of who she was, and the trust that I would know what to do with it. She knew that the people who spend their lives accumulating power by diminishing others are always building on borrowed ground. That the things taken without credit don't stop belonging to the person they were taken from. That truth, carefully documented, patiently preserved, and placed in the right hands at the right time, is more durable than any deception built on top of it. I think about that when I sit down to teach a new student who doesn't yet believe they have anything worth listening to inside them. I think about a woman who sat beside a child on a piano bench in Rosedale and said, "Most people hear, but you listen." And I try to be the person who tells them that what they have, the thing no one else is valuing right now, might be exactly what matters most. The greatest inheritances are not always the ones written into documents. Sometimes they live in the things we're taught to see, the patience we're taught to carry, and the moment we finally understand why we were being prepared all along.